All right, people. I take it is that way too loud. Un momento, un momento. All right, people. All right. Inna alhamdulillah wa kafah. والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المصطفى وعلى عباده الذين ارتضى ومن بهداهم اهتدى وبآثار أهل المدينة اقتفى وبعد فسلام الله على القوم. Alright. I was just checking on Facebook and YouTube to see that it's coming through fine, that you guys can hear me okay. Just hola at me, people, hola at me. Let me see that everything's all cool. Alright, what's going down? Mutiur Rahman, Ash Aslam, Frowdy, Frobbery first. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Let me bring up these comments for YouTube as well. Guys, alright. Somebody, I'm Batman, amigo, alright, you're doing it. People, just to make sure that the volume's coming through fine, that there's no issues with that, just before we begin, I'll just slightly move this back. Right, somebody said, Mufti, you never reply to my DMs. Yeah, you have to build a suspense sometimes. Right, speaking of suspense, people, today's guest, let me bring up the profile for our guest tonight, the esteemed honorable Chaplain, all the way from Boston. Alright, this is Hamzah Raza, that you can see right there, a fine graduate student, people, of Islamic Studies from Harvard University, from the Harvard. Right, so he graduated from Vanderbilt. I'm not sure if I'm probably totally mispronouncing that, but in 2018, in BA Religious Studies, he received the highest honors possible for his senior thesis on the role of Muslims in the anti-apartheid struggle, and we'll speak a bit about that today as well. His writings have been published in USA Today, the Huffington Post, Jacobin, Alternate, Muslim Matters, the Grey Zones Project, and Mondoways. I've got no idea what some of them are. That's my fault, because I'm so living in a bubble. Let's bring in our guest, people. Alright, ahlan wa sahlan. Ahlan wa Right, alright. Assalamu alaikum, Hamza. Shukran for being on MindTrap with Mufti. You are live. Alright, so how's it going over there, man? What's going down, Hamza? Let me just bring up, I'm trying to fit you into the, look at that in the logo right there. So I know we've been trying to set this up for a little while now. Obviously Ramadan timings have been a bit all over the place, but shukran once again for taking the time out for coming on tonight. So alright, we've got people right here. Look, right, people posting away with their comments. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. Hamza, right, ahlan wa sahlan. Let the fitan and fasad begin. So what have you been up to, Hamza? What's going down in America, in Boston, man? How's it going?
Alhamdulillah, things are good. I'm at my parents' house now in Maryland, actually. I haven't left the house in like 2 months. The last time I left the house was March 13th. So, just been trapped, waiting for this COVID stuff to end. Ramadan has actually been surprisingly good, alhamdulillah. It's been good to, we've been praying Tarawih like inside my house. It's been a nice moment for, reflection, and a good moment to kind of be secluded and be away from society and to sort of like look inwards, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So, but in terms of you're still keeping active with some of your work. You're involved in a few different kind of things, ain't you? For our viewers, fill us in on the different kind of projects or thoughts or circles you're a part of. Your life, what preoccupies your life.
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student in Islamic studies at Harvard. So I finished up my last final a couple of days ago. So inshallah, I should be graduating in a couple of weeks, inshallah. And then I'm also the Muslim chaplain at Boston College for kind of the remainder of whatever academic year we have left. So just engaging with students and trying to help people, better understand their religion. And it's a learning experience for them in terms of like technically learning from me, but it's more so a learning experience for me. I feel as though I learn a lot from the students and I learn a lot more from them than they do from me. So the students teach me a lot more than I end up teaching them. Alhamdulillah, being a chaplain has really um, taught me a lot in terms of, how to engage with people, how to help people better understand their religion. And it's really required me to kind of know where the resources are and kind of who to go to learn and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and you've done your undergrad, your BA, you did at Harvard. Is that correct?
My BA was at Vanderbilt.
Oh,
My MA
okay.
was at Harvard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all right. I'm sorry, I'm mixing the two up. So, I mean, this wanting to study Islamic studies as a degree, that's not a common kind of choice, is it? Like that's something quite almost odd.
Uh-huh.
Tell us about that. What's that all about?
So the way it started was in the UK, you guys have to enter sort of a degree program from the moment you come in. But in the US, you can sort of be undecided the first 2 years or so, and then it's really the third year that you have to decide. And your third and fourth year, you do the necessary coursework. So my original plan was actually I wanted to be an investment banker because I thought that that makes money. That's what is like that's what life is about.
That's where the money is.
That's where the money is. Yeah. There you go. I could work at like Goldman Sachs or something one day. So my first year, I was studying. My first 2 years, really, I was studying math and economics, and I studied Arabic the summer of after my first year of university in Jordan. And over there, I took some like very elementary like fiqh classes with a teacher, and I was just really, really impressed by sort of his character, the way he would act, and I love the fact that like whenever we asked him a question, like there was just this whole manner in which he answered the question. Like Aisha radiallahu anha, she said the Prophet Muhammad Islam was the walking Quran, and I
Mm.
felt like I had encountered a sort of walking Quran, and I was like, wow, like what a time it is to spend time with a person like that. So then when I
Wow.
came back to the States and I entered my second year at the university, it was kind of like, oh, let's forget about all that and let's go back to studying math and economics. And then there was a class in the religious studies department that was called Islam in South Asia. And I thought to myself, oh, this will be an easy A.
Hmm.
Islam in South Asia. I'm Muslim, I'm South Asian. What could there possibly be to learn? And then we did this whole survey of, how Islam got to South Asia, the spread of Islam in South Asia, all the way down to sort of, 20th century issues, all the way down to partition and all this sort of stuff. And I thought to myself, there's this rich Islamic history that I know nothing about. So
Hmm.
I thought to myself, I'm going to keep majoring in the subject. I'm going to keep majoring in math and economics, but I'm going to take as many classes in this department as I can. And so the next semester, I ended up taking, I think, 2 or 3 classes in religious studies. And I thought to myself, oh, I can still complete the other two majors while taking as many classes as possible. And then the end of my sophomore year, I thought to myself, if I want to take classes in this department, why don't I just do my major of study there? Because that's what I actually like to do. And yeah, that's how it sort of culminated. And in college, I also had a great interest in sort of student activism. I was
Hmm.
very involved with sort of like prison divestment, with
Okay.
Palestine solidarity stuff, all of that. And the math and economics professors, they weren't all that sort of amicable to that stuff. But the professors in religious studies, they like if you talked about Palestine in class, they were people who were very kind of attuned to the issues on the ground. They were kind of there were people who kind of shared my worldview, and so I just liked hanging out with them. Also, I just really liked the faculty, and I really liked the coursework, and
I
yeah, so
see.
that's how it sort of happened.
Wow. I mean, a lot of people who who study who want to study Islam usually take a very kind of traditional, if I can call it traditional, kind of a pathway. So they might go to a madrasa, or maybe study with mashayikh, or maybe taking a university route seems so much more career oriented, generally speaking. I mean, in general things, like, if somebody wants to become, I don't know, they want to pursue a medical field, or they want to become an engineer, or they want to do something, university. So I don't know. I mean, how does that then pan out? Because I'm assuming in the UK, there isn't much of a career role for people coming out with, on the other end, with Islamic studies. But I don't know. How do you feel about that?
Most people in the US, in order to really get a career out of it, you have to have kind of like a PhD. Like even with a master's or something, there are limited career opportunities you'll have, but if you want to do stuff within the Muslim community, you really have to have traditional education. No one, it's another thing that Muslim academics have like a difficulty with. Whereas like when I go to the Muslim community with sort of my master's, and very little sort of traditional education, they're like, oh, you studied Islam from non-Muslims, you studied Islam from Orientalists. There's kind of like, I'm
Mm,
not taken seriously within the Muslim community.
yeah.
But then within the academy, Muslim academics have the same issue, because it's like, oh, you're this biased Muslim, you're not someone who can look at things objectively. And there's a whole history of sort of like Orientalism and this power dynamic attached to that. So it's something that's very difficult for Muslims in the academy. Whereas in Jewish studies, if you are non-Jewish, you are an outsider, right? In Latino studies, if you're not Latino, you are the outsider in the field.
Yeah.
In African American studies, if you are an academic studying African American studies who's not African American, you are the outsider. Whereas
Yeah.
in Islamic studies, if you are a practitioner of the religion, if you are a practicing Muslim, you're an outsider in the field that you're studying. And this is changing very much over the years, but it's a very big difficulty that Muslims have.
Yeah, you're right, actually. I never really thought of it like that, but I see your point. How, because the whole narrative, the key players of that narrative, the Orientalists, and how they've kind of shaped that discourse, it would be entirely almost alien to somebody who's just a Muslim.
Yeah,
Yeah, wow, okay. And then you followed on from there to Harvard, where you're at right now.
yeah, and
So,
it's also very much changing. Like actually, Jewish studies had this issue about 100 years ago, where it was mostly non-Jewish academics who were scholars of Jewish studies, and then there was a movement of sort of young Jewish Americans who said, you can study in like a rabbinical school, but then you're only speaking to the community. Whereas if you become an academic, you are, broadcasting what our beliefs are, what our religion is, what our cultural identity is to the entire world. So the reason I think the academic study of Islam is useful in a Western sense is because you are not influencing how the people at the masjid understand the religion. You're not influencing how practitioners understand the religion, but you are influencing how sort of the world understands Islam. So if someone like CNN is like a major news channel we have in the U.S. If someone goes on CNN and they say, if CNN is looking for someone to bring on as an Islam expert, and one person says, I've studied the Dars in Islamic curriculum, and the other person says, I have a PhD in Islamic studies from Yale University or from Harvard University or from the University of Chicago. CNN will take on, the guy with the PhD over the guy with the Dars in
of
Islamic
course,
curriculum.
of course.
Yeah, even though the Dars in Islamic curriculum, in my opinion, is, I mean, from what I've seen from people who are traditionally trained, it is something that's a lot more extensive, and you're going to get
Of
more
course.
comprehensive understanding of the religion. But it's just the way the power dynamics are designed that
Yeah.
you get more legitimacy from non-Muslims with your PhD than you do from, a sort of traditional classical study of the religion.
All right. People, shukran for all your love. A lot of people sending their love this way. This Farooq Haroon, you're doing it, and Azarati as well. Shukran. Hamza, I wanted to, so, just out of curiosity then, so this, because somebody who, like speaking from my own perspective, I've studied traditionally as far as Islam is concerned and the sciences and things like that. I have studied with secular universities, but not really. I mean, Islamic stuff. I suppose I did. I had my master's, part of it was in religious education, so it was covering, but it's more about how to teach religion as opposed to studying it. So, I mean, what were some of the challenges that you faced? Because it's different when you're studying Islamic studies at a secular university. They're obviously challenging so many narratives of Islam, so many like they're not taking everything as they're taking nothing as a given. It's not taking everything, taking nothing as a given. Everything is up for scrutiny. So I mean, sometimes it doesn't have to be evil. It could just be that, look, because they're coming from, like how we would question something that we're not so kind of submitted to. So were there certain shock factors that you got whilst you were going through certain topics or certain, projects?
I think one difficulty I had at first that was sort of a shock is, someone will mention something crazy that Muslims were doing like 500 years ago. And then you have to realize that just because a group of Muslims did a thing in history, that doesn't mean that it's in line with, what Allah and His Prophet ﷺ are teaching, right? So I'll learn, 500 years ago in the Ottoman Empire, like this was going on. And I'm just like, wow, like astaghfirullah, like how could something like that happen? But then when you go deeper into it, you realize that it's not me who's saying, wow, astaghfirullah, why did that happen? But there are people in that time period saying, in this area, this particular activity is going on, and this is not in line with the religion. But, so just because Muslims did something historically, particularly after, the Prophet Muhammad, after the early generations, particularly people who are not ulama, it doesn't mean that that thing was okay, right? So that's one thing.
Of course.
And then the second thing is that oftentimes in academia, there are no truth claims, right? So no one will ever say this view is correct. So they will give you a historical perspective on a particular issue, and they'll say, this is what this group believed, this is what this group believed, this is what this group believed. And I remember, one time I was in class and, we were being taught the view of the Khawarij on a particular issue. And the view of the Khawarij was presented as, equal to the view of, Ahl Sunnah, equal to the view of this group, equal to the view of that group. And then I thought to myself, the Khawarij are the people who killed like Uthman and Ali radiallahu anhum, right? So it was strange to me that the Khawarij view was presented as this view with like, no good or bad attached to it, right? And in my view, these people are, horrible people. They killed, the last two caliphs, right? But in academia, you're not attaching a good or bad to things. You are
there's no kind of value judgments in that sense.
There's no value judgment. Exactly.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, I think they would recognize that, look, this is Orthodox Islam doesn't recognize these people as, let's say, being obviously good because they've killed the caliph or they're behind this kind of insurgency. But they themselves won't be emotionally attached to either group in that sense.
Yeah.
But it's just, it's just amazing how just thinking in certain ways with, just not having blinkers. And I don't even mean this in a like a sectarian or a negative way. But like, I'll give you an example. Just recently, I've been really looking into this topic of Moses and Akhenaten, and are they the same, one and the same, or are they different people, or what? So some people have kind of there's a Egyptian historian, Ahmad Usman, who's written quite a bit on this topic, and he's kind of turned the chronology, the biblical chronology, on its head. Everything is. But as I was just going through this topic, it just, sometimes you just ask yourself a question, and that question could be so simple, but it just blows your mind. Like, I was just reading through, and I was just contemplating, and it was discussing the events of the Exodus and things like this, and allegedly, like, so in the view that Moses comes down with the tablets, and obviously, as it says in the Bible, that, you know, God had written the commandments, but, you know, it was written by the finger of God. Now the question just occurred to me that, has writing even been invented? That, you know, because I know this sounds crazy, but writing generally, cursive writing, by and large, hasn't really been invented. And, because, I mean, generally, I'm assuming it's probably 600 to 800 years BC that cursive writing really appears from the Phoenician script. Moses, if he's anything from 1300 to 1500 BC, as some people are saying. So, and I know that, okay, so there is hieroglyphics, which is, you know, the Egyptian, and there is the hieratic as well, the kind of priestly script. But it just got me thinking that, wow, so okay, so let's say, even if we're saying Moses wrote this and God didn't write it, Moses would have written this in Egyptian script. He wouldn't have written this either in hieroglyphics or hieratic, but he wouldn't have written it in what was later Paleo-Hebrew, because most likely that didn't really exist at that time, and the Israelites definitely weren't a people that could read and write. Now, even though I don't even know what kind of ramifications this question has, but it's such a basic question. But you would, you know, in all my previous years of having done hifz of the Quran, read the tafsirs, reading these things, learning fiqh, living in a madrasa for years, you know, I never asked this question that, you know, could people even read and write then? But it's, what I mean is, sometimes in academia, you will be made to look at things from such an angle that may even be simple, but it just stops everything for a moment in its tracks. I don't know if there were certain standout moments for you when you're studying Islam.
This happened to me actually when I was taking a class in Christian studies. Can you see me? You're frozen on my screen, but can you see me?
Yeah, you're going fine. I mean,
Okay.
everything's. I mean, everybody can see you, so don't do anything funky. We can see you fine in case you start to disrobe, or you think, well, since they can't see me, I'll just take my trousers off and sit here relaxed.
I'll take my topi off. But I was taking a Christian studies class, and a lot of it sort of aligned with the Islamic narrative. That, you know, the earliest biblical transcript that we have is 200 years after Isa alayhi salam, you know, is raised up, and the Christian historians say that these copies that exist 200 years after, there are hundreds of thousands of, you know, differences. And, you know, I thought to myself, you know, like, alhamdulillah, like, you know, this aligns with the Islamic narrative. And I thought to myself, you know, these same Christian textual critics, they believe in the preservation of the Quran. Like, there's ijma amongst Western academics and among, like, Muslim ulama. So I thought to myself, you know, this is something that really aligns with the Islamic narrative. But then the historians of sort of, you know, Christian textual criticism, they ask, was there even a text given to Isa alayhi salam? Because they're like, we don't even possibly know what the original text looks like, because the latest texts come 200 years after, and they are so different, right? So that was something
as in by text, you mean a book?
Yeah, whether there was actually a book given to Isa alayhi salam. And that was something that shocked me, because I thought to myself, you know, of course there was a book given to Isa alayhi salam. But I realized this is a faith-based claim, that we believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Isa alayhi salam the Injil, right? But
I mean, some have said Injil, you see, if it just means gospel, the good news, is that a book, or is that just a kind of inspirited message of good news? I mean, what is that actual? Is this the discussion at hand? Okay. Mm-hmm.
But also I realized that, like, the lack of historical evidence for something doesn't make it not true. Just because there's no historical evidence of Isa alayhi salam being given a book, doesn't mean that it doesn't mean it's not true, right? So that's another thing in academia, that someone might make a claim and there's a way of reconciling it with your faith, but on the surface, the people who are teaching you, they're not looking to increase your iman. They're not looking to, tell you that this view is correct. And that's why I think Muslims in academia will really struggle if they don't know ulama, if they don't know scholars who can kind of
Mm.
give them the whole worldview on something. And I think another issue in academia is it's all about reading a text and then writing a response to that text, and that response might entail like a 20-page paper that you and the professor are going to read, right? But you want to like really thoroughly engage with the text in that sort of manner, and there's this emphasis on like critique and that sort of stuff. And the idea of critique is you should understand the text and then you should give a sort of response. But what
Mm-hmm.
a lot of graduate students in academia do, because they're overly excited, is they'll read the works of a figure and they won't fully understand it when they critique it. So they're sort of kind of straw manning the argument.
Yeah.
Whereas when I've studied with traditional ulama, there's a really, really big emphasis on really, really understanding the text. So like the
Mm-hmm.
40 Arba'in of Imam Nawawi, his 40 hadith collection, I
Yeah.
studied it in a class I took that was a class on the major works of Islamic civilization. And during that class, he gave us the 40 Arba'in of Imam Nawawi as a reading. He gave us the Arabic and English, and we read both of them. And then we wrote a one-page response to the entire Arba'in of Nawawi. Like, what do we think of it? What stood out? What would we push back on? That sort of stuff. And then we spent an hour and a half of class, discussing the hadith tradition. And then we spent an hour and a half, going over the Arba'in of Nawawi. Whereas when I studied this with, a traditionally trained Islamic scholar, we spent, 20, 30 hours on this text alone. And we went hadith by hadith, discussing it, breaking down every single little word. So there was a huge emphasis on really, really understanding the text. And in academia, there's less of an emphasis on, studying classical works cover to cover and really, really comprehending them. So, and, there are strengths to both of these things.
Of course, of course. And now, life as a chaplain. What is it how you expected? Is it very different? I mean, give us a kind of glimpse of what's going on. Has it shocked you in any way, or what has it brought into your life?
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back, I feel like as an academic, one is very much trained in sort of critical thinking and all of that. Whereas with classical Islamic training, not to say that they, don't critically think or something. I don't want to, undermine anyone, but there's a huge emphasis on content. So when I came into the chaplain position, I was severely lacking in sort of the content element. But alhamdulillah, I had people I knew who were, well-trained Islamic scholars. And I was able to kind of go to them and sort of catch up on this sort of content area. So that was one thing that I needed to do myself. The way I got the chaplain position was the person who was the chaplain.
And this is at Boston. This is at Boston, is it?
At Boston College, yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So the person who was the chaplain before me was also a master's student at Harvard, and he asked me. He said, "Do you want to be the chaplain?" And I thought to myself, like, no, I'm not qualified. Like, I'm just a Western academic. I write these papers that one guy will read.
Oh,
Like, no one should.
being humble.
Yeah, being humble, but also being realistic. Like, I'm not someone who people should go to like learn.
Were you saying no? I'm not worthy, but inside thinking you better bloody choose me.
Inside, like, oh yes, I get to indoctrinate the youth, but or continue. I'm sorry.
No, is this a big place, by the way? What is this Boston College? Just to get an idea of it.
Boston College is it's a university in the United States. If you look at like the rankings of United States universities, it's a very prestigious university. It ranks
Oh, it is. Okay,
pretty
wow.
high. Yeah, so the students that I'm dealing with are very kind of intelligent, like cream of the crop of the U.S. you could say.
Creme de la creme.
Yeah.
Oh, rather.
So my friend who was a chaplain before me said, don't think of yourself as you're like a sheikh when you're in this job, but think of yourself as like
as a
someone
priest.
as a priest. Think of yourself as a sort of mentor to them. So he said, because in many cases I'm only 1 or 2 years older than some of the students. So the one thing that surprised me the most was I was really scared at first. I was like, people are they're not gonna want to like learn. So I'll just be giving a khutbah once a week, maybe get a little halakha going, but there won't be much there. And I thought to myself, how can I get people, interested in the religion? And because the way with me wasn't necessarily that I learned a lot when I was, studying Islam, but I came in touch with people who really made me, fall in love with the deen. And I feel like teaching love for the religion is something way more important than teaching content. Because if someone has love for the religion, they will gain in the content as they go. But if someone doesn't have that, if someone is just learning content, then they'll just stop, once you're done teaching that particular thing. But love for the deen is something that is really important to instill in people.
That's very well said, that is. Wow.
And so one thing that I found really amazing was as soon as I got in, there were a lot of young people really eager to learn. So I think very often we think to ourselves, these young people, they don't come to the masjid, they don't want to learn the deen, this and this. But the reality is that there are so many young people who are really eager to learn the religion, and the issue is that there aren't enough ulama to teach them, or the ulama aren't they're not connected with ulama who can teach them. They're not connected with these walking Qur'ans who are sources of knowledge. So I kind of realized that someone like me who knows ulama, who knows people who are learned, part of my role is sort of to connect the ideas I'm learning from these ulama to people who otherwise might not encounter them, or get these people in touch with ulama. Find a way that I can get these people
to serve as the kind of conduit, the thing in between, to kind of have that a connection, to make that connect.
Yeah, like a sort of middleman. Like I didn't study at Al-Azhar, I didn't study in Syria, I didn't study in Darul Uloom or something. But I know people who studied in Darul Uloom. I know people who studied at Al-Azhar. I know people who studied.
But I got my people.
Yeah, but I got my people. Like someone once told me that in life you don't always have to have all of the answers, but sometimes you just need to know the people who do.
Spitting wisdom right here on MindTrap.
Yeah. So if your car is messed up, you don't need to know how to fix the car, but you need to know who the mechanic is, right? So similarly with the deen, you don't need to have all the answers, but you need to know people who can guide you through the process of getting the answers.
Yeah. So, right. Sorry. Just just momentarily sidetracking. Somebody had posted. Somebody's put a question, David, about the writing that I'd mentioned, the Canaanites. Yes, of course, that is what I did mention, by the way. Not to sidetrack, I can discuss that on Monday nights with Mufti. But the Canaanite script is the Phoenician script. And the Phoenician script, which you're talking about, the cuneiforms and things like that, it only developed into the cursive nature, which was also called Paleo-Hebrew, much after. So, but did the Israelites have it in Egypt? They wouldn't have had it. So I mean, it's very unlikely they would have had it in Egypt. That was my point. But let's not sidetrack. Coming back to this, so what are Hamzah? So what are some I don't know, some wacko scenarios or some crazy stuff that you've had to face being a chaplain at Boston College? What are the young people, the young Muslims up to?
I wish I had something like spicy I could tell you, but for the most part, young Muslims, they want to go to Juma, they want to, if they're not praying five times a day, they want to get to praying their 5 salahs. If they're not, if they're praying their 5 salahs, they want to start praying sunnah. They want to learn how to like better worship Allah. They want to connect, with their creator. Like, I guess one thing that's interesting is when you enter a university, particularly in the U.S., these students academically, they're on the same par. They came from very good high schools. They scored very high on their standardized exams. They had good grades. So there's a sense of continuity there. But in terms of deen, there isn't a continuity. So there are some students who will come to me and, my Arabic grammar is very, very bad. So they'll probably know better Arabic grammar than I do. They'll have done this, 3-month Quran intensive, and, they'll be telling me about, like sarf, nahu, balagha, all of that. And there are other students who will come and they'll say, before I came to the university, I had never been to Juma before. So they'll say, at first I didn't really know what was going on. Like, I came and I thought, the speech was nice, but then everyone started praying and I thought, what's happening now? Like we prayed together too after Juma. and little stuff like that. So there is a sort of a lack of like continuity with regard to that isn't there on like the academic level. And so one thing I realized is you gotta kind of start from the basics, and there are very basic texts that I think young Muslims should read that will really help them in sort of connecting with this
Okay,
rich
like
tradition.
what would you suggest?
Like actually, I have one right next to me. This was not planned, but
Coming prepared.
yeah,
You. The
this is
Book of Assistance.
the Book of Assistance by
But
Imam Haddad, which is
Haddad, okay.
like he basically gets Ghazali's Ihya and he summarizes it into very short parts. So this is basically like a summary of the religion, and each chapter is between 1 and 2 pages, and the longest a chapter will be is like 5 pages, right? So this is a really really good book for someone just to get a very basic understanding of their religion, and whether you just learned how to pray or whether you've been studying the Deen for 20 years, like Imam Haddad is always relevant. And
Wow. Okay.
Imam Haddad has this quote where he says, "Knowledge is repetition." So his students, he would make them, study a book like this, of very short elementary text, and then they would go for 3 or 4 years and they would study, and then they would study the same elementary text again, because these are texts that the more that you read them, the better you engage with them.
Wow. Okay, I see. I see. And what are there any other suggestions as well for what to read in English? Because I get asked this a lot, and the dilemma I have is, you see, I did my basic learning of the Deen, decades ago. Yeah. So, and ever since, my reading about Islam is now just research, and the research is seldom done in English. So I'm usually, I don't know, I'm Googling research, I'm reading up certain things, it's just it's just investigative learning. Now, a lot of my stuff is done in Arabic. When people ask me that, look, oh, I want to learn something I want to get more involved in the Deen, I want to read, I want to, what should is there a good seerah, is there a good tafsir of the Quran? I'm so confused in what to say to them, so kind of baffled that I don't really have a response, even though it's such a simple question, because I just simply don't know. What would you say, that since you're, in the heart of this kind of problem, you've got young students around you trying to reconnect to their faith, what do you tell them to read?
In terms of Sirah, I would say I actually wrote a paper in undergrad where I was looking at 5 Sirah texts, and I
Okay.
was sort of five like translations, 5 biographies of the Prophet Muhammad SAW in English, and I was comparing these 5 texts, and one of them was written by Martin Lings, who
Yeah,
is a
yeah,
Muslim.
yeah.
One of them was by Sayyid Hussein Nasr. It was like Muhammad, man and messenger, I believe. And he is, he wrote this book as sort of for high schoolers to like understand their religion. One of them was by Anne Marie Schimmel, who, to my knowledge, was not a Muslim. One of them was by William Montgomery Watt, who was a very huge German Orientalist, and he was someone who he was a Christian priest. I think he was an Anglican priest, and he actually believed that the Prophet Muhammad SAW received wahi. So me and my friends joked that William Montgomery Watt was like basically a Muslim, and he divided it up into 2 books: Muhammad SAW in Makkah and Muhammad SAW in Medina. And then the 5th book I looked at was Michael Cook's I forgot what it's called, but like don't read that book. It's not very good. It's
Yeah, yeah.
very kind of Orientalist and all of that. But I was comparing these 5 books, 2 of them written by Muslims and 2 of them written by non-Muslims. And my favorite, or 3 of them written by non-Muslims, and 2 of them written by more Orientalist types. And Anne Marie Schimmel was someone who had like a great admiration for Islam and a great admiration for like Tasawwuf, for Sufism, and I really liked the Martin Lings book. It was
Martin
great.
Lings. Okay.
I really liked the Sayyid Hussein Nasr book. But when I was reading the Anne Marie Schimmel book, I actually was brought to tears as I was reading it. Which is
Wow.
funny
Okay.
because I'm in this academic setting. I'm sitting in the library. I'm with my friends. They're studying for their exams. My friend is doing his organic chemistry. My other friend is doing like calculus. And I'm sitting there and I'm reading my book and I just start crying. And one of my friends looks at me and he goes, "Is everything all right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, this text, like, subhanAllah, it's just so beautiful." So Anne Marie Schimmel's, it's called "And Muhammad is His Messenger, alayhi salatu wasalam." It's an
And
amazing book.
Muhammad is his messenger.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. She starts it off, and I feel like before you read that book, you need to read a chronological biography. So Martin Ling's is like the best chronological biography that I've read. And then Sayyid Hussein Nasr's is also very good because it's a quick read. And the Anne-Marie Schimmel book, she only spends about 15 pages on a chronological biography of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and then she spends the rest of the book analyzing the beauty of his character and all this sort of stuff.
Wow.
And I think she has a chapter dedicated to Iqbal's poetry about the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So it's something that it's really important for us to understand. The Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is not, a human being. You shouldn't study his life as a human being, beginning, middle, and end. But you study his life as this sort of, as this sort of light and as this sort of model to represent that he was for us. And you got to connect with, his character. So I feel like that book does a really good job on that.
Wow.
And then,
okay, so you'd rate that number one out of them.
Yeah.
What's it called again? What did you say it's called?
And Muhammad is his messenger.
And Muhammad is his messenger. Cool. All right, that's awesome. I'll definitely. Somebody had put up here the study Quran. Would you? I don't know if you've read that or read from it. Would you recommend that, or what's your thoughts on it?
It's funny because people have a lot of critiques of kind of like the perennialism within it, the idea that Islam doesn't abrogate previous religions, but the perennialism really only exists in like 3 or 4 verses, right? As a whole, the study Quran is amazing because the footnotes in it, they take from Qurtubi, they take from Ibn Kathir, they take from Zamakhshari. So especially if someone doesn't know about these texts, especially if someone isn't trained in Arabic and all this sort of stuff, the study Quran is really one of the best English translations out there.
I mean, I would imagine so as well, to be honest with you. I watched one of the lectures by Joseph Lombard on it, and where he was kind of I think it was actually with a non-Muslim that he was speaking about the study Quran, and they were going over just the whole project, how it began, the difficulties along the way, how it took so many years to kind of and really just exhausted and depleted their efforts, and then some of the backlash, the criticism. He was just discussing it, and I was really wowed by the whole, the level they took it to in that he was explaining in that lecture. So yeah, what was the second book that you were saying?
And then the second one is M.A.S. Abdul Halim's text. It's the Oxford translation of the Quran. And then I really like Muhammad al-Ghazali's thematic commentary of the Quran. And then what is another one that's good? Those 3 are generally pretty good. I like Maududi's tafsir a lot. That might be a bit controversial, but I feel like Maududi's tafsir is actually very, very good.
I mean, he had written Tafhimul Quran, yeah?
Yeah.
And my understanding is he had written that so in a way that the common person could access the Quran. That was the kind of maqsad, the objective behind it. Because sometimes tafsir, like if I think about it, tafsir, you see, because once again, I've got to remove layers and lenses because I've been through a learning system. So when I read, let's say, the tafasir, like if I pick up Qurtubi, or the other day I was looking at Ibn Ashur on a certain mas'ala, and Ibn Adil in his Lubab. But you see, there's so many things they're discussing, but to me, I'm acquainted with the topics. They're going to be saying, well, this group said this here, the Mu'tazila said this grammatical error over here is presented in this way, and this is how we respond. But to the common person who just wants to understand the Quran, let's say, this kind of stuff just they would lose the actual message in trying to understand what's being said. The terminology, you couldn't get around the terminology. You'd have to learn the actual sciences. So I heard that Maududi, when he wrote Tafhim al-Quran, that was one of the kind of, although I haven't actually read much of Tafhim al-Quran, but I heard that was his objective. Because I have at times seen some tafasir in Urdu, and to be honest with you, they are... once again, they're not, even though they may not be that difficult for me, but I can imagine they would be very difficult for a common Urdu speaking person, because they just use Arabic terms all the way, and istilahi terms, which if you're a regular person, you wouldn't. Like if I was just reading and they said, well, ye to yahan pe masalih mursala aur istihsan ka ek masla hai. I mean, nobody would even know what the hell I've just said. Like, that wouldn't even make sense to people. Because what is this ihsan? I mean, what is these? These are not words used by... This is like Arabic terminology in fiqh.
Yeah. It's like, unless you've studied usul, you're not going to understand that.
Yeah.
And Maududi actually didn't even call his work a tafsir, even though it effectively is. He calls it tafhim al-Quran, towards understanding the Quran.
Yeah.
And what someone told me is that an exegesis is a commentary of the text, and Maududi's text is more of what's called an eisegesis, where he is using the text as a commentary of what's around him. So it's almost like a social commentary that he's writing.
So what's that? Eisegesis.
An eisegesis, yeah.
Eisegesis. All right. Rocking it with the vocab.
I was telling a sheikh in Jordan this once, and I said, this is an exegesis and an eisegesis, and he said to me, what does Jesus have to do with this? And he's like, why are you saying Isa and Jesus?
All right. So, right, tell us a bit about your thesis. What's all of this about?
Yeah, so
since we're speaking to an academic, it's not every day we get to speak to academics, people. Talk to us about, in academic speak, what's going on.
So, my last year at the university, I was taking, or my second to last year, what we call my junior year. It's a 4-year system, so my third year. I was writing, I was taking a class on democracy in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And in South Africa, they had, at the end of apartheid, I should explain what apartheid is, just like very, very elementary. Go for it. So apartheid was a system where...
Not like any of our dumb viewers are going to know what that means. Thank you for trying to totally infantilize our viewers who don't know what an apartheid is. No, I'm joking. Carry on.
One of my teachers, he said there are 2 things you have to do when you teach people. He said the first thing is you can't be late, because if you're late, people are going to think that you don't take them seriously. And he says the second thing is
don't molest them. That's how not to teach.
And then he said the second thing is you can't make the person that is learning from you think that you're better than them, or that you think that you know more than them. And he said ideally you have to let them know that you're there to learn from them as much as they're there to learn from you. And he said that if you don't actually think that, then you shouldn't be teaching. So it's So with that, I'll give a brief summary of apartheid, not because I don't think that people don't know what it is, but just because I want to give, a sort of solid definition.
After that, we'll move into the definition of the particle the, pronounced at times the. This definite article will speak about it shortly.
So apartheid was a system enacted in 1947 up until 1994, where different racial groups were apart from one another, and they were given their own specific areas to live in, and your race defined how many rights that you had. So many people know, white people had rights under apartheid and black people didn't have rights. But in actuality, there was actually a 4-tiered system. Okay. And white people had, full civil rights, full, citizenship under apartheid.
Like a comprehensive service.
Yeah, they had it all. They were chilling. So, if you're white and you don't know that non-white people exist, you might not even know apartheid is happening. I mean, you will, because there's this black labor that they're using. But in theory, if you're white, like you're living your full life, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second most amount of rights were this group called Indian people, and these were Indians who either came as indentured servants in the late 19th centuries to Durban. So Ahmad Didat came from that group. They were Indian South Africans who were brought as indentured servants. And then there was a second class of Gujarati and Nayman businessmen who came in sort of like the 1930s. And a good amount of these Indian South Africans were Muslims. And then the third category was they had less rights than Indians, and a lot less rights than white people, and they were called colored people. And colored people consisted of mixed race people. So if a black person and a white person had a child, it was illegal for black and white people to have have relations with one another. But it happened, and then the child would be what was called a colored, and they would have even less rights than white people and less rights than Indian people. So colored people, they had their own townships, and then there was also a group of people who were classified as colored, and they were the descendants of Malaysian and Indonesian slaves who came to
Right. Okay.
Cape Town,
Are
and they
these the Cape Malay
these
people?
are the Cape Malays
Cape
exactly,
Malay. Okay.
and
Yeah.
they intermixed with the black indigenous African population. So these what were called coloreds, and there are in South Africa there are like colored communities, and Cape Malay became almost like a religious identity. So colored people
Okay.
who were Muslims, they were classified as Cape Malays, and they were considered the group of colored people closest to Indian people. So they had like it the best out of all the Indians, out of all the colored people you could say. And then there are other colored people who have the same like racial heritage, but because the Cape people were forced into slavery, a lot of them weren't able to preserve their religion. So colored people oftentimes come as a result of this group, or there'll be people who are mixed race and that sort of stuff. And I think mixed race is actually even like an offensive term in South Africa, but in the United States it's not, and I don't think it is in the UK. So I apologize to anyone if I use that
Yeah.
term. I didn't mean it in a sort of derogatory way. And then
Sure.
below the colored people were indigenous Africans. So apartheid consisted of this sort of racial hierarchy. There were white people at the top, and then the second group on the pyramid was the Indians. The lowest group on the pyramid was the coloreds, and then the absolute lowest group was the indigenous Africans.
How did Indians get to number two? I'm trying to figure that out. How was it like the proto-Pakistanis bribing? Were they giving the rishwa trying to get to number two? How did that happen?
So the interesting thing is the Gujarati businessmen, the Gujarati and Memon businessmen who came to so the Western Cape where Cape Town is was ruled by the Dutch, and the Dutch didn't allow any religious freedom. So the practice of Islam was banned in South Africa for 150 years in the Western Cape under Dutch rule. But the British, who were ruling in the northern parts, which is like Durban, Johannesburg, these sort of parts, the British, granted, freedom of religion, you could say, like, allegedly in a way. So the Gujarati businessmen, the Memon businessmen who came, they thought to themselves, we are British subjects. Like, we don't really care about like the government oppression. We're here to, make money. And the British let us build masjids. The British let us build mosques. The British let us practice our religion. So they didn't really oppose the government as much as the people in the Cape were doing, or as the indigenous Africans were doing. Because the indigenous Africans, the land was colonized from them. The colored group, they had a history of sort of, slavery that they were opposed to. But the Indians, they kind of just came in and they said, yeah, the British are fine, just let us run our businesses. So
Business,
they
huh?
were, yeah, so they were the least opposed to the apartheid system, and they were the most kind of amicable to white people. They were the most friendly to white people in a way you could say. Um, so where was I going with it? I feel like we got sidetracked. What was I in? I forgot the initial question I was
I
answering.
mean, this is the question really to put to your life. Where are you going with this?
Oh man, I was explaining apartheid. That was
Yeah, of
so
course.
apartheid was a system where these four groups were deprived of your racial identity determined how many rights you had, and you were put in like different townships, and this was the nature of apartheid. So I took a class at Vanderbilt. It was a political science class, circling all the way back. And at the end of apartheid in 1994, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where it was headed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and they wanted to establish the truth of what happened under apartheid, all the horrific things that happened, and they wanted to reconcile the country. And there's a huge question today of, are South Africans actually reconciled? And I would say that a lot of remnants of apartheid still remain. But the
Of
objective
course,
of
of
this
course.
commission was to reconcile these four groups that were divided as a result of apartheid laws. And the professor that I took the class with, he actually played a very, very large role within the TRC, within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was a white South African, and we studied apartheid all the way from Dutch colonialism up until modern issues going on in South Africa. And as I was going through the book for the class, and me and the professor, we were very close, and he was someone very supportive of the Palestinian struggle. So me and him would talk outside of class about that and all of that. And he actually once told me, he said, in order to really understand Israeli apartheid, you have to understand South African apartheid. So I was taking the class and I was, is there a big Muslim community in South Africa? And he said to me, numerically, no. He said they're 1 to 2% of the population. The actual number is they're 1.3% of the population in 1994 at the end of apartheid. And I asked him, I said, why is it that when we go through this book about the history of the anti-apartheid struggle, there are all these Muslim names. Like Muslims are everywhere in the struggle. So he said to me, he said, this would be a good project for you to do research on. All I know is that there aren't that many Muslims in South Africa, but they're very, very, involved. So he said, you as a person who studies, Islamic studies, as a person who, has a bit of understanding of, the intersection of Islam and politics, says if you do an independent study with me, I would love to do the research. Like, I would love to see your research findings. He says, like, it would be good for me to understand my own country in a way. So okay. I do 1 semester of independent study with him, and then I apply for a summer grant to do research in South Africa for about 2 months.
You fly over there.
Yeah, and my university actually funds it all. And
you naughty, getting free holidays in the name of studies. on the back of all that suffering, you get to chill.
Yeah, so free trip to South Africa. It's for the sake of research, but it's really I couldn't think of any other way to have fun. I spend 2 months and I'm just eating biryani with Desi uncles, and they're telling me their life stories. Mm-hmm. And not just Desi uncles, but Malay uncles, African uncles also, but a lot of Desi uncles.
Just uncles, or are they? It's just uncles. It's Ramadan, so we'll keep it to just uncles, huh? So, somebody might ask this question, real talk. Look, apartheid, the whole thing is tragic. And that's for sure, unquestionably. But is it really relevant now? I mean, somebody might say, is this relevant? 2020, what's this got to do with me? What's this got to do with the world today? We all recognize it was bad. How do you feel this is relevant?
So the reason I think that it's relevant is first of all, as minorities in the West, we need to learn how to engage our broader society, which is something that Muslims in South Africa have really, really effectively done. At the end of apartheid, Muslims are 1.3% of the population, but they're 16% of the first parliament.
How much percent? How much percent? 60. How much percent of the parliament?
16%. So 16.
16.
Wow. 16% of the first parliament, while being 1% of the population. So Muslims are a community that there needs to be more research done on this, but proportionally, however you define racial community, however you define religious community, Muslims were the most involved community in the anti-apartheid struggle. And so this really gives us, and as a result of that, Muslims are widely respected in South Africa. So one thing that's really beautiful in South Africa is it's really easy to find halal food, even though Muslims are such a small percentage of the population. Because Muslims have these relationships with other people in society. And, people don't mind, making their restaurant halal, right? I remember I pulled up at Johannesburg airport. I was wearing I was wearing a topi and I was wearing a shalwar kameez. And I meet these tabligis and they say, where are you from? And I tell them that I'm from the US. And they're like, is this your first time in South Africa? And I say, yes. And, these tabligis, they sit me down at a restaurant in the airport and they buy me Nando's. And they're like, what do you want? And, I'm a little skeptical because I'm like, Nando's just sells chicken. And the tabligi looks at me and he goes, yeah, you're really not from here. He goes, most of 90% of the restaurants in this country are halal. Nando's is halal. So Muslims are very widely respected in South Africa. You see, these people, wearing topis with long beards and, just walking through malls and no one bats an eye. No one thinks that they're not a part of society. No one thinks that they are, somehow a foreign threat. And, women will be wearing niqab in a mall and it's not a big deal. Muslims are just as much a part of South African society as any other, non-Muslim South African in the eyes of the 99% of society that's not Muslim, right? Meanwhile, in the US, in Europe, we see our societies, sort of grappling with this institutionalized Islamophobia, where there's...
the majority of the non-Muslim society in South Africa, is it when you're saying the 99%, what is that? Is that generally, by and large, mostly indigenously black, or is it Cape Malay, or is it still a white proportion there, or what is that mix-up? What is that makeup of the non-Muslim today?
I wouldn't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it's overwhelmingly African.
Indigenously black. Yeah.
indigenously African.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
probably 60, 70%, and white people are maybe like 10% of the population.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but in the United States, for example, there's what Mahmoud Mamdani calls the good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative. So if
Okay.
you
Who's
the
this?
good Mahmoud Mamdani is a professor at Columbia University.
Okay.
Um, he's a really good scholar on like the politics of being Muslim in the 20th and 21st century. And
Okay.
yeah, he's a really really great scholar, one of really the best people in the field. And he writes about the good Muslim, bad Muslim distinction. And he said
What
that
is that? The good Muslim, bad Muslim. What's this about?
so the good Muslim in the eyes of Western society is Ahmad, the guy who drinks alcohol, doesn't pray, and doesn't talk about the Iraq War, doesn't talk about the Israeli occupation of Palestine, doesn't talk about the Saudi bombing of Yemen, doesn't talk about political issues that put the kind of the imperialism of the West into question, doesn't put the problems of Western foreign policy into question.
This is the good Muslim. This is the good or the bad?
This is a good Muslim.
This is the good
Muslim
one. Okay.
is apolitical and a-religious.
Okay. He's
And then the
what?
bad,
Apolitical and irreligious.
yeah, irreligious.
Okay. Just ethnically Muslim kind of thing.
Yeah, like my
Like
parents,
Islam is like an ethnicity kind of thing. Yeah.
exactly. Islam is a social identity, but this social identity doesn't pose any threat to really bad flaws that exist in Western society, particularly with
Okay.
regard to our foreign policy, particularly with regard to lack of spirituality. Whereas the bad Muslim is someone who prays 5 times a day. The bad Muslim is a woman who wears hijab. The bad Muslim is a Muslim man who has a beard and won't shake hands with women, because this doesn't fit into the moral fabric of Western society. And the bad Muslim is also someone who talks about the failures of American foreign policy, talks about the failures of Western foreign policy in general. So there's like this. You could think of it as similar to in apartheid. There's this hierarchy within the good Muslim and bad Muslim. There's a hierarchy also.
Yeah, but that's it. I mean, there'll be many non-Muslims who will still equally problematize, let's say, Western foreign policies, or they will question, they will protest. A lot of anti-war cries and things like this. I'm just out of curiosity. These are not strictly Muslim kind of domains.
Yeah, it's also like to fit in society. Like like Lupe Fiasco, he has this lyric where he says, society is pretty easy if you don't comply, pretty easy if you comply, pretty easy if you don't complain, right? So a good Muslim doesn't necessarily comply with the norms of Western society. So similarly, there are non-Muslims in our society, people like Jeremy Corbyn, people like Noam Chomsky, people like Cornel West, people like Mark Lamont Hill, who well, Mark Lamont Hill is actually Muslim, so that's a bad example. But Mark Lamont Hill, I don't think most people know he's Muslim. But these are people who will talk about the Israeli occupation. They'll talk about bad for imperialist foreign policy, and they're not accepted in society also. But so this doesn't just apply for Muslims, the political part, but the religiosity.
You're right, because people like Noam Chomsky, who's so outspoken, I mean, and the blessed kind of longevity he's had in his life. I mean, he's still vocal, and I feel that it's such a shame that Muslims don't really capitalize on such a resource really for for us today. But the way he's despite all of that, it's like a huge part of society doesn't seem to accept him, Noam Chomsky. I mean, for the left, obviously he's there, but generally people see him like, even though he's a legend, I mean, he's one of my heroes in that sense,
Yeah, but he's someone who goes against the orthodoxy of society.
Yeah.
So bad Muslims are those who question the orthodoxy of our society, whether that be on a political level or whether that be on sort of like a spiritual level. But the interesting thing about Muslims in South Africa is that they are bad Muslims in this sense. They are deeply invested in their religion, and they're deeply invested in politics. They're deeply invested in the anti-apartheid struggle, but they are fully accepted in their society. And we need to, so I think it's important for Muslims in the West to understand why that's the case. How can we be bad Muslims? How can we be people who are deeply invested in our religion and deeply address very problematic, political points of our societies, and still be accepted in society?
But somebody could question here. somebody could question that's because the Muslims in, let's say, South Africa are part of the struggle which represents South Africa, as in the sense that they are obviously the anti-apartheid kind of movement, but following that, they're not necessarily critical and anti-South Africa, whereas many Muslims today, or like many Muslim narratives, the kind of backdrop in Muslim societies is an anti-Western kind of narrative, that the West are these kind of like almost like these Ya'juj and Ma'juj that have come and kind of, you know, destroyed and, you know, raped the Muslim world of its resources, and they are always the Antichrist and the devil. So Muslims that grow up here and become religious, they then tap into these narratives and they think, well, yeah, you know, well, of course, look, that they're bombing Iraq, it makes sense, they are. So there's a lot of the narrative is very hateful towards the West, whereas you know, whereas in South Africa or in other parts of the world, or even, let's say, you could say a Muslim growing up in, I know now there's a lot of things in China, but generally there's a lot of, you know, with the Uyghur Muslims, this kind of discrimination. But that said, there isn't a worldwide Muslim anti-Chinese narrative. Like, as far as the Muslim world is concerned, they don't really care. Like, if anything, China's either an ally or it's indifferent. Like, there's no hate against China, even though, ironically, many Muslims in the past thought Ya'juj and Ma'juj were the Chinese. You know, it's like behind the Great Wall of China. But, so even if Chinese do, you know, they've got atrocious human rights, let's say, things, but Muslims won't view them necessarily so bad. But the moment the West do something, there's this huge narrative which is so anti-Western. I mean, doesn't that have a role to play in all of this?
Yeah, so it goes to how, you know, Muslims want to understand how they're going to make these critiques. So if you look at it in the UK, I saw this Vice documentary of people in the UK who were like, they say that voting is kufr, which is, you know, Imam Razi, the verse that they cite, Imam Razi says the only people who understand this verse this way are the Khawarij. So they have this like neo-Khwarijite narrative, and they go around London, you know, giving out pamphlets like "Stay Muslim, don't vote." And it's
and that's, you know, like these fools like Hizb ut-Tahrir and some of these other kind of groups do that. I mean, shocking that they do that in 2020.
Yeah, but there's a statement that I think Baldwin or Frederick Douglass made. I'm forgetting who, but he said, "I too am America." So like, it's important for us Western Muslims to understand that we are Westerners. Like, I am someone who, you know, my family has been in the United States since the 1960s. So I am a part of this, you know, American fabric. Like, most of these Western Muslims, if you were to put them in Pakistan, if you were to put them in Egypt, if you were to put them in, you know, Bangladesh, if you were to put them in Turkey, they wouldn't fit in because they are, you know, Westerners. They are Americans. Yeah. So it's important for us to embrace our identity as Western Muslims and understand that as much as the critiques that we have of our various countries, like as much as the critiques that I have of the United States, I too am America. And as much of the Iraq war is something carried out by the American government, the movement opposing the Iraq war is also very much an American movement, right? The biggest anti-Iraq war protest held in the United States was by Imam Mahdi Bray, who was, you know, an imam. Or if you look at you know, if you see Trump as, you know, this image of the United States, you have to understand the Women's March, which was the largest march in the history of the United States. It also is America. And one of the people organizing that march is Linda Sarsour, you know, a Palestinian American woman. So she has as much claim to being an American as Trump does, right? So it's very, very important that we as Muslims, we don't couch our criticisms of Western foreign policy in an identity where we alienate ourselves.
Yeah. So and I feel that sometimes, you see, we have to not forgetting. It's like how you said, look, it's important to know aspects of history. It's important to know, for example, the apartheid kind of struggle, to be able to identify, to be able to recognize pointers of how people built up a civilization and society after that. Similarly, it's important not to forget that, yes, many atrocities have been committed by, you know, by the empires and the occupational kind of powers during occupation and during the whole kind of you've got this whole era of the British Empire out there and all these other countries. But you see, what the colonialists did, I feel it isn't really, we have to jettison to some extent that kind of this prejudice and this kind of like lens that we carry, which straight away sees people today, like let's say society in 2020, London, Birmingham, or wherever, or in America, but I'm speaking about the British because of the colonial kind of past. The people today are not those people, and many of these people today would equally condemn the actions of the past. So what happens is and I fear that this kind of this idea, it germinates so well in Muslim circles because of the past, because of the suffering, and the schools that have kind of continued that. So let's say in India, being Pakistan as well today, when the British were there, they obviously finished the entire madrasa system. So the madrasa system that began anew during their time, which was the Deoband kind of system, and then an offshoot of that, or not an offshoot, but a reaction to that, the Brailwi system. These are madrasa systems that came about during colonial times. So there's always this, the enemy, the other, this kind of hatred. We hate the English language, we hate this, we hate their dress, we hate their way of life, we hate these are the absolute Dajjal, this is them. So yeah, and I feel that does so much damage today, because I can understand it makes sense then if you lived under the British Raj. But today in 2020, still having this kind of it's so harmful, I feel, because it doesn't let people organically, it doesn't let Muslims organically develop. Because that, you said like, being, you are American, you are America, as much as anybody else. It's true. And I feel in some way Americans have it a bit easier. I don't know. I mean, maybe not easier in some ways, but when it comes to identity, because America, I suppose, is itself quite young as a country, whereas the whole British thing is so old and, and ancient in that sense. People now, okay, they will say, look, we're British Pakistanis, we're British this, we're British that, British Muslims. But people still struggle here. It is still in some ways like, a good example is like saying English. You see, like I live in England, but yet I don't know how people feel about this. You see, like, would you say you're English? Now, to me, the understanding of English is somebody white. Still, like, it's not. Whereas British, I suppose, is everybody. Now, I might be wrong in that. I'm just telling you what I experience when I hear that term, like English. Like, I don't envisage like somebody black or somebody Asian or somebody like, whereas British, okay, but English, I would think Now this is still a residue of this whole kind of growing up with all this kind of identity struggle. So I mean, I just felt it's important to kind of say that these are huge problems. And I know you were highlighting, this person was saying the good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative, probably tying it in with that. But okay, I mean, would you feel that are these kind of issues that you've studied in your have you finished your thesis, by the way, or is that still going on?
Yes, this was my undergraduate thesis. My master's is coursework based. I have sort of an answer for why American Muslims, I think, have an easier time than British Muslims, and this is because America is advertised as this land of immigrants, and it erases this whole legacy of settler colonialism, where we wiped out the indigenous native population. But it's like America is a land of immigrants. If you come here, you work hard, you can achieve the American dream, and you too can come to the highest levels of society. Whereas there isn't really a British dream. So immigrants are sold this thing in America that you can be part of the moral fabric, that you can be part of this melting pot. Whereas in the UK, it's kind of like, we colonized India, we took trillions of dollars and resources, and in exchange, we brought a bunch of like, people from like, like we brought a bunch of like Sialkotis and a bunch of people from like Mirpuri,
And they're still regretting it. They're doing toba, 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 toba. Because the Pakistanis that came here were just all rural, yeah, or from like the countryside back home. It's no city folks.
But I think the one kind of remnant of colonialism that Muslims need to, that individual Muslims need to grapple with. Obviously, like for like India and Pakistan, like there should be a notion of reparations because like the UK took all of these resources and stuff. But like on a personal, like individual basis, there's this idea of sort of decolonization of the mind. Frantz Fanon talks about this. He's considered like the father of decolonial theory. And
what's his name?
He says the most powerful tool that the colonizer has is your mind. So we need to think about it. Why is it that if someone, has read, Shakespeare and, all of these sort of, white people thinkers, they're considered intelligent, but someone who hasn't read Ghazali, someone who hasn't read, Ibn Sina, someone who hasn't read Suhrawardi, someone who hasn't read Hafiz, someone who hasn't read, Aisha al-Adawiya, someone who hasn't read Rabi al-Basri.
Look at the name dropping. Going down, people. It's going down.
This is what academics do, right? But there's this whole like tradition, there's this whole intellectual tradition that you can be an intelligent person in our society without ever having encountered. So we need to analyze that, why is it that we exist in a society where all of these things are what it means to be successful? There's this Eurocentric means of being successful, whereas there isn't this, you can ignore this whole great intellectual tradition that we have, and you're still considered, a capable human being, right? Mm-hmm. So it's very, very important that we decolonize our minds, that we engage with these thinkers that have been sort of left out of the Western corpus and that are a very, very, very important part of our society. Frantz Fanon, he ends his book where he says, let us stop imitating the West and let us turn towards ourselves. And he talks about this idea of the national bourgeoisie. So he says in post-colonial countries, after the colonizer leaves, he says there will be this class of people that are basically, black and white people in black and brown skin. So, if you go to, these foreign countries, if you go to a place like Pakistan or India or the Arab world, the most wealthy people will be people who speak English in their homes. There'll be people who have like, this sort of secular education. They will be people who are unaware of this, whole intellectual tradition that exists within their societies. So it's really, really important for us to uncover the jewels of that tradition. And very many people will say, these are the people who colonize these people. So therefore, their intellectual tradition is better, right? But the reality is because, the playground bully was able to, overpower you and take things from you, it doesn't mean he's better at that way of, living everyday life than you. It doesn't mean that he has all of these better things than you. So I think if Muslims really want to decolonize, it shouldn't be in a state of animosity towards the West. They shouldn't hate the West.
Of course not. But I want to just pick on that point there, that look, this thing about saying, just because they... Well, there was a bit of feedback there. Just because they colonized us doesn't mean we have to copy them, or we don't have to do... Isn't that... Why is this giving me feedback all of a sudden? One moment. Right, so... okay, it's just so annoying. This is giving me... Just started all of a sudden. It's picking up your mic. But anyway, isn't this, as opposed to them copying them because they colonized them, could it not also be because those things seem to be, they seem to have some currency? So, for example, the internet, the technology, the tools, the gadget, the science, the money is coming from, the designs are coming from this part of the world.
Can you repeat that? I didn't really understand you all that well. It's kind of cutting off.
Yeah, I'm trying to see why it's doing that. Let me switch. I shouldn't really be. It's giving a lot of feedback to me. All of. Hello.
Hello. I can hear you now.
Oh, can you?
Yeah. Alhamdulillah.
All right. Okay. So let's give that another go. Gonna switch these other things off.
Yeah, it's doing it again now. I'm sorry.
I don't know why that is. Is it? I think it's coming back through your kind of mic. Wait there. Because I don't think it's on this end.
Okay, let me try. Okay, speak again.
Yep. Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, and then let me re-put this in.
Okay, so yeah, that's a lot better. Yeah, that's a lot better. Right. So as I was saying, is that you'd asked a question. You'd said, look, just because the author said that because these people had colonized us, we don't need to think they're so great. Yes, they ruled over us, but we need to grow out of this thing of them being so amazing. But what if what I'm arguing is the things that people are drawn to. I know Ibn Khaldun argues this as well, that look, people are always the occupiers are always held in awe by the people being occupied, so they end up emulating them and copying them. This was what Ibn Khaldun's part of his thesis in the Muqaddimah. But I would kind of add a nuance to that, you see, a slight spin-off, that you see the occupying forces, or today, even though they're no longer occupying, they've moved away, they usually are stronger in resources. They have more wealth, they have more, and with that comes culture, with that comes fashion, because you have more leisurely time, resources, you have these minds that are slightly creative in that way. Thereby, you get a lot of the largest, let's say, fashion designers in the world, maybe coming from the West. Now, people are naturally drawn by aesthetics to certain fashions. Now, they will say, hey, that's slick. Because it's chic and because it's so on point, it attracts people. It's not, what I'm trying to say is, does it have to be necessarily because they were the occupiers? Or is it that that having a certain amount of resources attracts a certain amount of talent that attracts people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the two are interconnected, because then you ask yourself, why did they have those resources? And the answer is because they were the colonizers.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm not denying that part. But what I'm saying is that there's this argument that you see, the attraction is merely a superiority complex. That so for example, we dress like, let's say, people in the West, Western clothing, because we hold the Western people to be superior. But is that the case, or is it that it actually tends to, in certain cases, look better to people? Like, does certain things appeal to certain people? Now, one could say, well, Western music, for example. But it could be that as Western music has proliferated, people actually find it appealing. So I'm just saying, as an example, Bollywood could be exactly the same. What I'm trying to say is that I'm arguing against that it's always a superiority angle. It could just be that it comes across chic and comes across kind of attractive to people.
Yeah. I guess one shouldn't say that this means that everything Western is bad, right? Like, if you like, I can like Western clothes, and it doesn't mean that I have an inferiority complex, right? It's like you said, it's often connected to the fact that Western manufacturers have the most amount of resources, right? Like, if you look at universities in the world, the best universities are the universities that just have the largest endowment. So if someone, I asked actually one of my professors this, he did his PhD at Columbia University, and he studied, Sufi shrines in India. So I asked him, I said, why didn't you do this in India? Because, he's all about, this decolonial theory also. I said, why would you go to this, prestigious Western university? and he said, for the research I wanted to do, the reality was the most resources were at this university in New York City. It's ironic that I was studying, Delhi and Lucknow and all these places, but the resources were in New York City, so I went where the resources were. But I think oftentimes, like, decoloniality acts as sort of like a critique, right? It doesn't really give an answer in a lot of ways.
Because in
But
some ways, like I'm just putting the question out there, real talk. In some ways, were the Muslims? Muslims is such a broad term because it's not this. There isn't this kind of homogeneity in that sense. There isn't. It's like an amalgamation of so many cultures throughout the Muslim lands. But were the Muslims empires not just colonialists of themselves? Like, were the Ottomans not just colonizing Eastern Europe and colonizing Egypt and colonizing, and prior to them were the Abbasids, or Abbasids, for whenever they had power, and the Umayyads? Was this not just, or the Fatimids in, let's say, you want to say Sicily and in different places, were they not, was not everybody just doing the same? Were they not just kind of, how do we manage to be okay with, let's say, one set and not okay? Is it, what we're saying is that there were less atrocities committed? Because there were always atrocities. Wherever there's power, there is always atrocity. But but one could say, okay, under the colonial thing, there was a lot more atrocity. Is this the differentiation, or is it just because they're Muslim, we're not going to question that, when the Ottomans used to go around killing people, or, the Armenian genocide, or whether it's going to be things like or right early from or sectarianism, or they're going to kill off certain people for speaking, the Umayyads not allowing the Ajamis to speak. They had to speak Arabic if they wanted to live in certain cities, Basra, so on. How is this? Is it just? How do we justify this kind of stuff?
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this stuff you can't justify. So like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf says that when you read Islamic history, you have to take Iman pills because a lot of the way that these empires are acting is not contrary to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ.
Yeah.
But I guess this is like a major like question. Like, what does it mean? Like, China is also engaging in this sort of colonialism right now.
Yeah.
But I think on a very broad level, one can differentiate between expansionism and colonialism. So if you're expanding your empire and you are still giving people in that empire equal rights, if you are not taking resources from this part of the empire and sending it to the center and sort of having these people live on the periphery without rights as, as like second class citizens, then like that's not as much an issue. Like, expanding your empire isn't wrong, but the act of imperialism is. So you find examples in Islamic history where these Muslims, they'll go into an area, they give everyone their rights, they don't, steal resources from these people, then that's just expansionism. That's not colonialism. But
being real, I mean, let's be real, right? They look. Let's say they landed in, let's say, North Africa. The Muslims did in the time of Bani Umayyah. I mean, they're gonna take all the resources they can take. I mean, they're not gonna be like, well, this. But it is interesting how under the Islamic empires, the indigenous people seem to accept that message, and they become part and parcel of, because there's no way, like, if you're going to look at just, let's say, the Arab invaders, that go into North Africa, they can't become North Africa. I mean, that's ridiculous. They couldn't just, they weren't that many people. It wasn't like, let's say, 5 million people came in, killed off 5 million people and became the new inhabitants. That even though there was a resistance, it is interesting that within usually a few years, they full on embrace usually Islam, they embrace their way of life. I suppose that's something that didn't happen necessarily or mostly under the colonial kind of past. They didn't seem to embrace, no matter what the... But otherwise, I mean, in many ways, they were also just kind of... But I suppose because we're Muslim and they're Muslim, it's easier not to kind of find faults with them in that sense.
One thing that I find interesting is that there was a part of the Umayyad Empire, there was a time period where they would actually discourage conversion to Islam
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
if someone becomes Muslim, they pay the zakat, and if they're non-Muslims, they're paying the jizya, which is higher. So you see these Muslim empires that in many ways are not acting Islamically, but
Yeah,
I think
I think it was actually the Kharaj thing, that more on land that they were paying, which was higher. Yeah, so than the zakat. But I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, so I do find it sometimes. The reason I'm saying that is because people sometimes sense this Islamic idyll, this whole kind of
yeah,
this utopia of
yeah,
Islam, and then along comes colonial powers and they kind of ruined that and put it on its head. But in all honesty, I mean, the Islamic empires, I mean, they were obviously, I feel, in their treatment were much better, incredibly better than the colonial powers were, uh, mainly because for some reason, I would say obviously it's welcome. I mean, it's difficult to explain actually, but for some reason, the indigenous people usually seem to have embraced them and their message, which didn't really work in the last 200-300 years with colonial powers. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, so I see this and I think, you know, that it's Muslims. We also in our history have have been doing a lot of imposing culture, imposing things, whether it's going to be certain times Persian culture, Turkic culture. All these kind of things are really imposed. The name Khan, all these kind of things, these Islamicized things, which today is really just coming from the Turkic people, a long embedded culture of a kind of Turkic colonization of the Muslims right from the early, one could argue from the early Abbasid time almost. They set their foot in. But yeah, so I just wanted to point that out because sometimes we do get, we get a lot of these people. I've spoken sometimes and they speak about decolonialization. And I think, but one could put some of these arguments just back to Muslims, to ourselves. We could just say, well, if you're going to say, well, yeah, but stealing resources, but then in all honesty, everybody's been stealing resources, you
Uh,
know. Like the gold in Damascus didn't just land there. The Muslims obviously robbed it from the neighboring dynasties. They obviously took over the Sassanids and they took over the Byzantines and they took over and with them brought immense amount of gold in. It didn't just land in their lap. I mean, human beings have been doing these kind of things since time immemorial.
I, I think there are sort of two, maybe I might have a third answer to that. So the first thing I would say is the issue is like nowadays we're dealing with the remnants of European colonialism. We're not dealing with the remnants of Turkic or Persian
Yeah,
colonialism.
true,
And
true though.
these are civilizations that we have this rich intellectual tradition that if we don't engage with it and just engage this European intellectual tradition, that tradition will be lost. So it's very, very important that we as young Muslims, that we as Muslims in general, engage this intellectual tradition that we carry. And then the second thing would be that what was my second thing? The second thing would be that from a faith-based perspective, I haven't really studied the history of this all that well, but from a faith-based perspective, we can kind of take pride in the fact that Muslim civilizations, as a whole, if you were to look at it, at the entire thing, we have been sort of better to religious minorities than say Europe was to religious minorities, particularly Europe actually. So we can kind of take pride in that. Like there's a professor at Vanderbilt where I did my undergrad. His name is David Wasserstein, and he wrote a book called How Islam Saved the Jews. And he says that if it wasn't for the rights that, because when the Jews are expelled from the Jews have considerable rights in Muslim Spain. Not to say that it was perfect, but
Yeah.
it was better than any other civilization at that time. And when the Muslims and the Jews are expelled from Muslim Spain in 1492, the Ottoman Empire takes them in,
And
the
even
Ottoman,
and North Africa as well. I mean, huge, like in
yeah,
Fez, there's huge Jewish settlements that took place at that. I mean, huge as in relatively huge. I don't mean huge,
yeah,
but Muslims, including scholars like Sheikh Ahmed Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, was some of the scholars that, when their rights were being jeopardized, stood up and fought for their rights and things like that. But yeah, sorry, carry
yeah.
on. Yeah.
Amir Abdul Qadir also, but the Ottoman Sultan, when he takes in the Jews from Spain, he thanks the Christians who persecuted or who expelled them, and he said, "Thank you for enriching my empire at the expense of yours." So there are all these examples, like Amir Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. He, sticks up for the rights of Christians and Jews in his empire. And David Wasserstein, who's a professor at Vanderbilt Jewish Studies, he actually ventures to say that modern Judaism would not exist were it not for Muslims who took them in. So that's something that we as Muslims should have like a pride in, and it should show that our tradition is about this pluralism and
yeah, because Jewish people, historically, throughout the Muslim era, throughout Muslim history, if let's just say the 20th century, ignoring the 20th century for a moment, putting it aside, prior to that, the Jewish people haven't really been viewed negatively by Muslims. They've, if anything, they've held some of the highest offices, besides the office of a caliph. Within Muslim, in some places they had offices as high as what would be a modern day prime minister or things like this. Partially because a lot of them were very well educated in their day and age. They were the scribes. In fact, there's certain books written by scholars condemning the caliphs because fistiktabi ahlil kitab, because they seem to employ and give higher office to the people of the book. Now, you see, so this recent anti-Jewish or this anti kind of like Jewish antipathy that we find amongst Muslims today commonly, like they say, Yehudi, this Jewish person. I would feel that this is a very recent a result of the Israeli kind of thing, as opposed to, I don't know what you feel on that.
Yeah, so there's this, scholars of like anti-Semitism have talked about this, that modern like anti-Semitism that exists in many parts of the Muslim world, it's actually a European import that comes as a result of European anti-Semitism. We have like the Holocaust that goes on. We have very, very bad things happen to Jewish people in Europe. And after the creation of the State of Israel, a part of, it's not to say European anti-Semitism goes away, but a part of, the power structure actually becomes amicable to sort of the Zionist movement, and the Zionist movement is closely linked to the Jewish religion. So then you see this sort of act of, the shift. And then in the Muslim world, you see this sort of, modern anti-Semitism. There's actually a really good book on this. It's called Islam and Freemasonry. Okay. And it talks about...
if it's not the Jews, it's the Freemasons.
So anti-Freemason sentiment in the Muslim world also comes as a sort of European import. And the original Freemasons were actually also very friendly to Muslims. So yeah. Abdullah Quliam, for example, was a fourth generation Freemason. But
I'm pretty sure, I think Jamaluddin al-Afghani was part of the Freemasons, if I recall correctly. Yeah, and was. I think they actually chucked him out because they said that they weren't sure that he believed in God.
And Muhammad
Taliban.
And then, interestingly enough, the Nation of Islam movement in America was founded by Elijah Muhammad was taught by this man named W.D. Fard, who was formerly a member of the Moorish Science Temple. And the Moorish Science Temple was founded by a man named the Noble Drew Ali, who was a Freemason who claimed to have studied with Jamaluddin al-Afghani at Al-Azhar. So there's this whole like history of Islam and Freemasonry that is covered in that book. It's a very short book. I'm forgetting the name. The author's name is Angel Miller. But he talks about how there was this Elders of Zion conspiracy in Europe, and later on that conspiracy was sent to Damascus, and Damascus is where you find the first of these sort of anti-Jewish conspiracy theories in the Muslim world, and from there it spread apart. So it's really, really important for us to understand that that Muslims for a while they had a very amicable relationships towards
for the most part, I would argue. Reasonably. I don't mean that there were no issues ever, but for the most part, as far as societies were that in that day and age, I would argue that they were quite amiable, and it wasn't something so tense the way it is today, and this is a very modern phenomenon. I mean, you're quite it's a topic, you know, close at heart with you, isn't it? The whole Palestine, as it is with all of us, you know, with Muslims generally, but you're quite socially involved in some of the activism, the whole Palestine thing. Is there, in your view, a solution to this problem? Yeah.
What I believe in is a sort of one-state solution.
One-state solution, okay.
So a secular state for all people, Israelis and Palestinians, from, you know, the river to the sea, from the West Bank to Gaza to Tel Aviv, everything in what is Israel and the Palestinian territories would be one secular state.
It'd be called Israel.
It would be called. This is a good question. Ali Abu Nima has a book called One Country, where he basically talks about a one-state solution, and he says that the country should be called Israel-Palestine, and he says when you say it in Arabic, you can say Palestine, Israel, and when you say it in Hebrew, you can say Israel-Palestine, but the naming would be...
No, but Israel is, I assume Israel is a secular country.
This is...
I mean, I would argue that many Jews living in Israel are not actually religiously Jewish, but they're ethnically Jewish. I assume, yeah.
So this is something that's very difficult. Israel has sort of grappled with this. Are they a state governed on Jewish law, or are they a secular state for Jewish people? And there's always this clash going on within Israel. So, for example, Jews cannot marry, you know, like Christian and Christian and Muslim Palestinians, and this part of the idea of that is like based on like the religious law, right? But
one could say Muslims say the same thing. You know, Muslims say, well, you know, Muslim women can't marry non-Muslim men. I mean, in most of the Muslim countries, it's illegal in most, not in all, but in most. So, you know, in this one-state vision, who would be the ruling power? Israel would be the ruling power.
So I think you would have to do what happened in South Africa. You would have to have, because in South Africa, one of the ideas was actually that they would have independent black homelands, and then they would have like a country for white people. So it's kind of like a separate states in that sense. And
but then that's not one state, is it? Like if we're gonna have separate, you mean like they would kind of they would be like an independent province?
Yeah, it was called Bantustans. And that didn't work out in South Africa. They determined we need to have one country for everyone. And what you see now in Palestine, if you look at the two-state solution, where Palestinians get 22% of the land, it's a non-contiguous state. One of the conditions of the two-state solution is that it's a demilitarized state. So the country won't have a military. So there never really was a two-state solution. And anyone who has studied the politics of it will tell you this, that the Palestinians were essentially offered, you know, a way to decorate their jail cells in a lot of ways. They were never offered a real state. So
let me just playing devil's advocate, but let me just put a question to you. I mean, what is the population of Palestine right now? What would you say approximately?
It's about a little over 6 million people, and then there are 5 million Palestinian refugees who were expelled in 1948 and 1967.
So that's not a huge population as far as countries go. I mean, if these, let's say, all the Palestinians were to be relocated in Arab cities throughout the Arab world, distributed like evenly, as in, but sporadically, not as in to create Palestinian cities, but just to kind of settle them in, with, as in, let's say, fully, you know, in accommodation, fully paid for, well-to-do, like, let's say, a flat, you know, where families live. They moved into a city in Cairo. They moved into a city, let's say, in Algeria, in Tunis, in Morocco, in Jordan. They kind of spread out throughout the Arabic-speaking world with certain funds, with a guaranteed education. And if Israel was to take that cost, because it would probably be cheaper in the long run than all the bombing it does, than to just pay to have all the, you know, like 5 million people be relocated, would that not be a better, more viable solution?
I don't think Palestinians would agree to that. And when I was in Jerusalem, I stopped at this shop like close to Masjid al-Aqsa, and I asked this man. I said, how long have you had this shop? And he said to me, he said, we've had this shop for 700 years. He says my family has been on this plot of land for 700 years. So how are you going to tell a man that because of um, why should he have to leave that strip of land? And
Yeah, because life is more valuable than land, and quality of life is arguably, a significant factor too. Because obviously we've got a kind of moot point where Israel is not going away; it's there to stay, and whether you like it or don't like it, it's there to stay. Now the thing is, living in a prison like Gaza is just a living prison. It's not like really, it's below living standards. So rather than having people live like that where they are just precariously kind of just struck dead every now and then because, they get close to a border, they just get shot dead, or they're always speaking about this kind of oppression, what if they were just relocated? I mean, what would be the... I know here's another, from a devil's advocate point of view, that even in the Quran, the Jewish people are just constantly reminded about, the kingdom on earth, to go and build the kingdom of Judea. This is ultimately what they've done. I mean, isn't this what, even in the Quran, the Jewish people were kind of, this was their maqsad in this world, to kind of build that state. Whatever it is, the loss, this sacred state in the Quran, al-ard al-muqaddasa allati barakna hawlaha. This was for Bani Israel, it wasn't for anybody else. So arguably they're just living out what the Quran even says that they're meant to be living out. So and I'm just saying from a devil's advocate point of view that, and the only people upset about it are the Muslims, the neighboring Muslims. But it's not to laugh at the tragedy, but I'm just saying at the irony. It's quite
also,
ironic.
Yeah, well, also the Palestinian Christians who live there. But
Yeah,
the thing is people have an attachment to their homeland, and they're not just going to give it up to, like, if someone came up to you and everyone in London and said, if you guys leave, we'll pay you to leave so that we can live here and carry out
Yeah, but if I was living in, yeah, look, if I was living comfortably, I wouldn't want to leave, because I've got a life. Let's say I've got a circle of friends. I've got my whole world revolves around my kind of, let's say, geolocation. But if I was living in like an expanded prison where I was just being tortured, I was witnessing people dying all the time, just surrounded by a morbidity and death, then in that sense, if somebody said, hey, would you like to go live in this capital city, and you can have a fully paid for apartment, and you can have free education for your children, and you can have this much money, let's say, as compensation, of course I would say, yeah. A question here: do you feel part of this, that not relinquishing your land, this is a kind of guilt that the rest of the Muslim world has kind of imposed upon Palestinians, in saying, you guys are fighting the good fight, don't give up, because because it's easier for people living in, from a safe distance. Like if people staying in Saudi Arabia in great comfort, or in Dubai, or people in London or Paris saying to Palestinians, don't give up the land, it's a good fight. But then, we're just reclining, drinking our tea and coffee. Do you not feel that that's part of that kind of like stay there is a guilt that we've imposed on them as a Muslim collective?
Mm-hmm. I would say the first thing is that there's a certain like life under occupation that people sort of, there's a certain beauty to life under occupation also. So it's not to say that Palestinians are miserable all the time, right? So when black South Africans reflect on apartheid South Africa, they weren't miserable all the time, but they knew that they didn't have full rights. So similarly, like Palestinians, they still have friends they hang out with. They still have these things. Their life isn't all misery.
No, I don't mean like, you see, even when you live in a prison,
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
so if a person goes to prison, you still, it doesn't mean that life stops. Like you still,
Yeah.
crack a joke at some point, you still talk to your cellmate, you still do stuff, but it's not, any instant you get at liberty, you will snatch it if you could. If they were to say, would you like an early release? Of course you want an early release. But
Uh-huh.
sure, you're playing games, you can play snooker, you can play pool, you can still, get your stuff. It doesn't, so I accept, I'm not saying that they're living in non-stop, incessant pain.
Mhm.
I'm sure there are intermittent moments of joy and relaxation, just like everywhere else. But it is like a living prison almost. It's like a prison strip, Gaza.
And then also, like for in the example of Gaza, right? In 2014, when the Israeli military killed, 2,000 civilians, basically everyone knew someone who was killed as a result of it. And these people, their grandparents were, expelled out of their land. There were people who died with the founding of the state of Israel in 1948. There were Palestinians who were killed and forcibly kicked out of their homeland.
Of course, of
So
course. Yeah.
if Palestinians were to say, we're just going to get up and leave, um, it would kind of be an insult to all those lives that were lost. They see themselves as part of a struggle to take back what's theirs. If someone, like for example, if someone were to, barge into your house with a gun, kick you out of your home with, and let's say one of your family members dies, and then you're living in this other, place 5 miles away, but the United Nations tells you you have the right to return to your homeland. You will eventually be allowed to return to that home, but for some reason, because of our lack of enforcement authority, we can't get you back to your home. And then the entire international community is saying you have the right to eventually return to your home. There's always going to be the hope of returning to your home. You
Yeah,
always
but
want to return.
I'm just
back to your
saying,
place.
in a very long, stretched way, in a very with hyperbole, the Israeli people are saying the same thing. This is our homeland that we're just returning to.
Uh-huh.
I'm just saying that this argument that this was the promised land, that even the Quran says this was the promised land for Bani Israel.
Yeah.
They're going to say exactly this, and that Muslims took it off us when they took over. I'm just saying, whether there was bloodshed or not. I'm not saying that it's there were no. Of course, there were tragedies, and the people that were massacred when, with the whole Israeli conflict, and when they took over by brute force and broke the kind of agreements, the peace treaties. But moving on 60, 50, 70 years now from that time when these things have happened, if if
Uh-huh.
if people
And the
are,
major-
yeah.
uh-huh. I'm sorry for cutting you off, but I was just thinking this. And the majority of Palestinians, they are actually the descendants of the Bani Israel. They were people who were Jews who then became Christians, who then became Muslims. So I find the argument,
That's not going to be true. The majority of the Palestinians are Jewish by descent. That's not going to be true.
I think it is. They've done studies on this. I read a
No,
thing
no,
on
no.
this before.
They would be Arab by descent. I know the Arabs are also Semites, ultimately.
Uh-huh.
I accept that. But they won't be the lost tribes of Israel. I really doubt that the Middle Eastern Arabs are the lost tribes of Israel. But,
Uh-huh.
but
This is also
okay.
something you can't really trace. So I feel like that argument is very difficult. That they're coming to this promised land because like
No, I'm
a
not supporting
Palestinian could
them.
convert to
Yeah.
Judaism tomorrow and have the right to return to Israel, even though like I'm not a descendant of the children of Israel.
True. Look, I'm not saying, although Judaism, to be fair, was mostly an ethnicity, it wasn't actually a conversion religion. So it wasn't people, through the mother, they became Jewish. It wasn't something like Islam where you convert. Majority of Muslims, in fact, almost all Muslims are like people embraced Islam, whereas they were kind of born into Judaism only, like I suppose like how Sikhs are now into Sikhism. So I'm not saying that, look, I think the Jewish people should be building the land of Israel, or that I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is this is a post-occurrence discourse. Like, this has already happened. They've already taken over, and they are here to stay. It's not whether we like it or don't like it, and I feel that there's been great atrocities committed. It's unacceptable. I think the Israeli state just works with impunity. Like, it doesn't give a damn about anything, about the loss of of the sanctity. It doesn't care about the sanctity of life. Now, given this, and when you know somebody is like that, it's like, is it not a lost? Like, should we not choose our battles? Like, because there's no, if a person here has a gun and you have nothing, or I have this cup, should I charge him, charge into him with this whilst he's holding a gun? I mean, the odds are that, heavily, if I was a betting man, I would bet the other way, that he's definitely just going to shoot me. So, is this not a lost battle, the whole thing? Like, what's the point of just elongating victimhood? Why not just say, well, okay, you know what? Okay, fair enough, we've lost this one. It's not the first battle that, as Ibn al-Khatib said, وَمَا هِيَ بِأَوَّلِ قَارُورَةٍ كُسِرَتْ فِي الْإِسْلَامِ. He said it's an amazing quote of his where he's talking about something about tragedies, and he says, but it was not the first glass vessel to have been broken within Islam. It's like, meaning that we've had other tragedies before. It's not the, yeah.
I guess my thing is I see an end in sight to the occupation, and I see a way that the one state solution will happen. And the way that I see it, especially as an American, my government provides a lot of support for the Israeli government, so much that if the United States were to, stop giving Israel arms, it would end tomorrow. Yeah. And the way in the United States it was before was that anybody who talked about, the Israeli occupation would be breaking orthodoxy, would not be able to, really function in political life, would not be able to function in social life. But what we're seeing now in the United States is we're seeing this opening where people are able to criticize Israeli policy. Bernie Sanders, who was the second last person remaining in the Democratic race, was someone very, very critical of the Israeli occupation, and someone who said, we should redirect aid that we're giving Israel to rebuilding Gaza. And there was polling done that actually 60% of people within the Democratic Party support boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And Shibli Telhami did a poll that 81% of Democrats who have heard of the idea of BDS, they support the movement. So I see it in the next 10, 20, 30 years, if enough activism is done on the ground, then the situation is resolvable, and we can see this.
But realistically speaking, even when we say that, like, what we're talking about is political pressure, political pressure for what? Like, as in, like, realistically speaking, what would it really do? Okay, there might be one or two sanctions. There's already sanctions in the United Nations, against Israel. So many kind of things have already happened, but they just don't care. It's not like, it's not like, does it really make a difference? I understand that countries might say, this is wrong, you naughty, it's not, but it's not, it's like, to Israel, it's like, well, okay, who gives a damn? Who asked you? It's like that. So, I don't really see a practical difference by just trying to say, okay, let's tell them they've been wrong and naughty on this. That they don't really, clearly don't care.
Well, sanctions here, I mean like an arms embargo, so we don't sell them weapons, which isn't an issue if like 2 or 3 countries don't sell.
If let's just say we reach a state where all Western powers withdraw any kind of support from Israel, let's say, and it's up for grabs, there would just be an unfathomable bloodbath that would happen there. I mean, even if, like, let's say we were to say they had no support and the Arab world could just come in, like they could just pour in, you would be speaking about a genocide. Even if it was an Israeli genocide, like, you would be speaking about a genocide. Like, you would, that, you see, it would only end horribly. Like, there would be no, and even if they killed so many Israelis, the scar that would leave in Israeli and Israelite kind of memories to only try and come back and avenge what has happened at some point in the future again is, I mean, do we not learn from history? I'm just saying.
So this is what happened in South Africa. The South African apartheid regime was very strong, supported by the US, the UK, all of that. And through a period of 10, of over 20 years, there was this international campaign to boycott Israel, right? The international campaign begins in the 1960s, and South Africa is free in 1994. So it's a 35-year-old or 34-year-old battle. And towards the end of apartheid South Africa, when no one is really trading with South Africa, aside from a handful of countries, the country is on the brink of civil war. So there is exactly what you're talking about. There's fear that there's going to be this genocide of the white population. And then the white African government, the apartheid government, they are forced to the negotiating table with Nelson Mandela. So I think the Israeli government, if there is this time where, you know, there's all this international pressure on them, that will force them to the negotiating table. And the one reason why negotiations have not worked in the past is because to successfully negotiate with someone, you have to have leverage and they have to have leverage.
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
So what I see the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is doing is it gives both sides leverage. If all this pressure is on Israel, but they're the ones with the state while the Palestinians are stateless, it gives a sort of means for them to sit down and negotiate. And inshallah, I hope that is what happens. I mean, no one can like really tell the future, but looking at the history of apartheid South Africa and how that situation, which seemed, as you were talking about today, which seemed irresolvable, which seemed, you know, all the power was on one side, you know, if you were to do this, there would be a bloodbath. Those same questions were asked in South Africa, and alhamdulillah, we have you know, a place today where everyone has political rights in South Africa. So inshallah, in Israel and Palestine, we can also have this sort of one-state solution where all people have their political rights. But yeah, it's difficult because when you're fighting in such a cause, you ask the question, you say, you know, is what I'm doing, will it be productive? Will it be something that'll give the right solution? And I think it's the way of the believer that we never give up. We always try to do what's right in the moment. And whether our solution comes to fruition, that is something that's not on us, but it's on us to put in the effort, right? We do the action and then we leave it up to Allah. So Musa alayhi salam, you know, his dream was to, you know, see the promised land. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to do it, despite all the effort he exerted, because the people around him weren't ready. So I feel like on an individual basis, it's up to us to do all that we can to help the cause and not be people who, you know, give up and throw up our arms, but be people who consistently like do what we can. There's a hadith where I think Albani narrates it, where he says that if you see the day of judgment, you know, happening before you, if you see the earth, you know, being swallowed up, and you have a seed in your hand, plant that seed. So it's not because you don't think.
No, that's a hadith in Sahih Muslim. Yeah.
In Sahih Muslim. So obviously you don't know that a tree won't come out of that, but it's in our.
It's about positivity and optimism.
Yeah, to take the
absolutely. Wow, spoken like a true chaplain. You're doing it, Hamzah. Like you know what? We've taken up so much of your time today. I know you've got iftar over there, but it's been awesome, incredibly awesome.
I got a nice.
Is that biryani? Is it?
This is kunafa.
All right, so I've got biryani downstairs, but it's been incredibly awesome discussing these things, coming to learn about certain facts involved in the apartheid, the struggle, how we can perhaps take from, you know, the lessons we can take from that, how to deal with a history of global colonialism, how that ties into Islam, and then also what about a major conflict in the world today and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Are there any solutions to things like this? Discussing these things, and even you know, some of these difficult kind of thoughts like, okay, what about this? What about giving up the land? I mean, it's amazing to just be able to say this stuff. Is there? Some people have just been going off topic on the on the comments, but is there any kind of message you'd like to give some of the viewers before we kind of wrap this up? Chaplain Hamzah, right from the chaplain, right? This is what would you like to say to our distraught, the lost tribes of this ummah? The wandering tribes that are still wandering. We still haven't finished our 40 years.
I would say on the Palestine thing, these aren't really my closing words, but one thing that you can do to help the Palestinian cause that you as an individual, as a consumer, you can do is support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And if you can just Google BDS movement, and they have a website, and the BDS movement has been able to accomplish a lot. Like the Labour Party in the UK, they introduced a resolution calling for an arms embargo on Israel, and that is something that is really effective that we can do.
Corbyn was great on that.
Yeah, but on the more like spiritual Muslim stuff, I guess like in this month of Ramadan, I guess we could close out with like a sort of dua. Like may we be people of sincerity. May we be, Ya Allah, make us people of sincerity. Make us people who use our time wisely, and make us people who are not only people of fikr, not only people who think and ponder upon things, but people who put our things into action, and people who don't let the things of this world distract us from what the real goal of our time on this earth is, which is to know Allah, to reach the sort of marifa. So
Ameen ya Rab, Ameen.
We rid ourselves of these veils and we're able to know Allah, inshallah.
Subhanallah, subhanallah. Shukran for that. And if people want to reach out to you, where should they connect?
You can follow me on Instagram. My @ is just my first last name, Hamzah Raza. I'm very, very responsive on Instagram. So if you hit me up,
I thought you said I'm very, very irresponsible. You naughty, making a confession right at the end. I said I'm very irresponsible. Of course I'm going to send these kind of pictures. Right.
And then my Twitter is @ Raza_Hamza. So @ my last name _ my first name.
Raza, it's been an absolute pleasure. Shukran for coming on, man. You're doing it. Guys, likewise, do reach out to the chaplain himself, especially if you're in America, or even if you're not. Instagram seems to be the place, or Twitter. The name I've got right here, spelt Hamzah Raza. You can see it right there underneath, just beneath. People, and if you haven't still subscribed to my channels, then God damn you. May your alarm clock not go off for sahur. Just messing, people. Take very good care of yourselves, man. As always, much love. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I'm going to put up the final slide right here. So, assalamu alaikum, Ustad, as well, before we go.
Wa alaikum assalam.